Hello and welcome to Module 6 of Documentary Film. And this week, things are a little bit lighter. We're going to look at two interesting developments in documentary, and we're going to thankfully look at a slightly more lighthearted issue, which is self-awareness, beauty, facelifts, and compared to Triumph of the Will, that is definitely an easier thing to consider. Daisy, the story of a facelift, will also be our feature presentation for this week, and also the subject of the viewing quiz for this week that starts tomorrow, tomorrow being Monday, the 15th, and will stay open until February 21st. Now, having said that, there's a corresponding article or essay in this book here, Documenting the Documentary, on page 322. The documentary of Displaced Persona, Michael RUBBO'S Daisy, the Story of a Facelift. So there'll be a reading quiz on this as well. Same structure as before, multiple choice, and they will both be open for the duration of this week. So I wanted to point that out to you. Okay, so the issue here, the important issue, is the difference between these two, I guess we'll call them viewpoints, or they're not modes because they can overlap at times. They shouldn't, but let's be clear on exactly what we are talking about here. We're talking about direct cinema and cinema verite, which is French for film truth or cinema truth. And again, put that in quotations because I've stressed all along that the notion of truth is contingent, it's subjective. It is basically what people bring to the table because each of us have our own lived experience and we see things that others do not. And at the same time, don't see things that other people see. So when we talk about truth, cinema truth, yes, cameras become lighter. Sound equipment and recording equipment also becomes lighter, but there's still all the work that's done at the editing table, right? The length of shots, how shots are manipulated, slowed down, speeded up, time lapse, music and sound effects that are added to these shots. We've seen already just in little over a month that we can see all the manipulation that is going on with the matter, the actual content of the film. So light cameras or not, it isn't just that. It's the way in which the filmmaker approaches the subject. So if we want to think of sort of a quick way of defining these things, we can say that direct cinema is non-interventionist, while cinema verite is interventionist. Now, what does that mean? It means, according to this article that I've also posted here, it's the relationship that the filmmaker or director has with the subject. When we see that relationship being played out on the screen, we saw last week with Fog of War, Errol Morris talking directly to Robert McNamara, posing questions, follow-up questions. He was doing this on the screen as well as undercutting what he was saying. So we knew this was not a pure expository film. It had the appearance of one, but it was something else going on. It was reflecting on the nature of truth. And the nature of truth has to do not with the veracity of the event, right? The fact that something may or may not have occurred. It's our interpretation of it. That's where it kind of muddies the water. So each of us will have a different interpretation of what we saw, but what we think happened, what people's intentions are, especially. So let's get back to the initial idea here, which is the difference between direct cinema and cinema verite. With direct cinema, it's non-interventionist. And so what's happening is, yes, the handheld camera is lighter. It's much more mobile. And as a result, it can kind of sit quietly in a corner, much like a closed-circuit camera does in just about every corner of the world these days. And it simply organically films what's going on. It does not intervene in any way. The presence of the camera would not have changed to any significant degree the events unfolding. Now that's kind of where things can get a little fudgy because people behave differently in front of cameras. And the presence of the camera, the knowledge that cameras are there, will often make people behave differently. They could be more guarded, and consequently they could be the opposite. They could be even more open and flamboyant. The presence of the camera will often change people's behavior, maybe not their awareness, but their behavior, because they know they're being filmed. So when we talk about direct cinema, the notion that the camera sits on a corner and objectively and passively views what is going on, really all I can say is the closest thing to it is closed circuit footage, right? Because that camera sits there in the corner objectively viewing everything and does not interfere. So what's happening here is the story unfolds organically as the camera rolls. So those filmmakers believe that they are simply objective observers, invisible, passive sort of observers, as opposed to directly intervening and responding in some way with the subject. And that's true. That's really what is happening with truth cinema, right? Cinema Verite. Here, this idea that film truth has to do with the filmmaker actively participating in the film as a subjective observer, posing questions, sort of, urging people to behave in a certain way. We'll see in Daisy, for example, there's an important scene where Michael RUBBO is literally sitting with Daisy in the waiting room at the plastic surgeon's office, and there's a gentleman sitting in the corner, and he urges her to go over and talk to him. That would not be direct cinema. If Daisy chose to speak to that person, the camera would have passively filmed it. But Michael RUBBO is actively engaging in the behavior or changing the behavior of the subject. So that's the main difference. So it combines observational footage, for sure, and participatory filming in the same breath. So the awareness of the camera that is filming the scene, thus establishing a connection between the cameraman, filmmaker, camera person, director, documentarian, whatever you want to call them, and those that are being filmed. So cinema verite, intervention, direct participation in the images and sounds that we see and hear, versus direct cinema, which is this passive kind of fly in the wall, observational mode of documenting. So that's really the main difference between these two. So keep that in mind as we look at the films over the next couple of weeks. So having said that, let's kind of work through the material that is here and kind of step back a little bit and go back to the National Film Board that we've talked about, John Grierson, the gentleman that we see right over here. The idea was for the National Film Board to make films about what was considered the working class back then. The Salt of the Earth. It literally is the name of a film made in the 1930s, The Salt of the Earth. So it's about the working class. It's about the otherwise silent and invisible individuals that make society run. And that's all fine and good. But there was this kind of paternal, sort of pedagogical view that these people were not the brightest individuals, not the sharpest tool in the shed, which is maybe why they're still working class. And that's what I mean. It's very paternal and derogatory, but let's set that aside. The NFB believed that the average working class person was perhaps not as informed as they should be in making important decisions about their lives, such as, maybe getting a break, maybe getting a tax break, maybe getting some kind of, opportunities. So Grierson and others like him, and this is an ancient view of the demos, right? In ancient Greece, the demos, Plato thought the same way. And Aristotle, as enlightened as he was, thought the same way. There was this belief that somehow the working class were in that position because of a lack of intelligence. So this paternal view of them, of kind of patting them on the head, going, there, we'll help you out. So to be clear, the NFB believed it was their duty to inform the average working class person about information that would help them to make more useful political decisions. So it became a way of educating individuals, as a way also, in this case, because we're talking about either between the wars, because it does start in the 1930s, and especially after the Second World War. Because if you think briefly about the reasons why the Second World War even occurred, is democracy was in tatters. And there were fascist governments in Spain, in Italy, in Japan, and most certainly in Germany that took advantage of the fact that democracy had been battered during the First World War. And now there was a concerted effort, both in England and certainly in Canada, to re-educate individuals about the importance of democracy, how it works, what its good points are, the importance of voting, for example. And this was done using films, using NFB films. At this point, too, in the 30s and 40s, and certainly the early 50s, television certainly is not around, but short films presented before feature presentations in theaters was. So this was a way in which the government arm, called the NFB, could, in a sense, propagandize certain ideas, saying that industrialization was good, oil wells were a good thing, exploiting natural resources was good. All these things had to be sort of sold to people, right? We had to consider this idea, and one of the best ways to do it would be in the form of a film. So the flow of government information was done in and through the National Film Board, and this was the reason why this thing existed in the first place. Now, as we well know, and especially even more so in a multicultural world, is the idea of Canada is not just working class people. It's not 98% working class, or if you want to be even more harsh, the 1% and the rest of us are working. No, there were a whole range of things going on both within the NFB and the relationship it had to Canada. First of all, it was not just documentaries. Eventually, more and more experimental films were being made by people like Norman McLaren. There were animated films as well. And the NFB went on to win many, many awards for their excellent work in animation. A lot of it very groundbreaking and very innovative. But this now sort of broadened the purview of the NFB in terms of what it could do. It was still an arm of the government because it relied on taxpayer money. So therefore, there was certainly a financial relationship between the federal government and the NFB. But the idea of Canada itself, and especially its citizens, began to become broader and broader. It wasn't just working class people, it was all kinds of people. And in fact, work that I did back in the 1980s through Cinema Canada, I wrote a lengthy article on the National Film Board and its depiction of immigration. And as you can imagine, after the Second World War, the view of immigration was pretty concise. It was mostly Western Europe. And it took until the 1970s for the National Film Board to even address the possibility of refugees, of immigrants that were coming from war-torn countries. And part of it was a response, for example, to the Vietnam War and people coming from Vietnam that were trying to settle in Canada. So it took many years for the NFB to even acknowledge that these people existed. So the idea of Canada may have been fixed in their eyes, but the reality of Canada was a much greater and much more diverse one. So it is a dynamic and constantly evolving one in which the NFB plays a crucial role in laying out and testing the imaginative possibilities that ideas through work of the imagination. So that list of individuals here, Norman McLaren, Claude Jutra, Michael Roubeau, Denis Arcand, and so on, all of these filmmakers really tested the waters in terms of what the NFB could do. And the good thing is it did expand, it did diversify, it did respond and reflect to a greater and greater degree the reality of Canada, and especially in terms of its citizens. So Michael Roubeau, the director of Daisy, this week's film, worked for the NFB, and his shooting style was quite different from what was developed originally by John Grierson. And Grierson really is known as the quote-unquote voice of God expository films, where images are at the service of the voice. The voice told us the truth. The voice organized the narrative. The voice also dictated what was considered important. And so as a film, it was more about what the audio content was telling us than what we were seeing. Michael Roubeau kind of plays with that template, and plays with this transparent, objective perspective of life. And he does this by, in a sense, placing himself within the film. This was something that just was not done. And this is still a fairly recent film. It's not an old film by any means, but it is a recent film in terms of the history of the NFB, starting in sort of the late 30s. So this kind of objective perspective of life, the voice of God, the expository form, it's now being challenged, it's being reformulated, it's being rethought, and the result are films like Daisy, The Story of a Facelift. So that kind of patriarchal perspective, the paternalizing pedagogical view of individuals and sort of the citizen that needs to learn something, it's now kind of gets set aside and different things start happening. Now, the film we look at this week, Daisy, does still have its problems, because there is still that patriarchal voiceover that is given to us by Michael Rubbo, and he, to a certain degree, does control the events and how we understand them, because he is still, one, the director, two, he is the editor. He chooses and selects which images we're going to see, and he, in a sense, is able to kind of play God, but in a different way. He's not the voice of God, but he does organize the text, because remember, every discourse is a construct, and please always remember that. Everything that is a film is a construct of one sort or another, of audio and visual information that is pieced together and organized in a certain way to reflect a main thesis. And so the perspective that we have is primarily of Michael Rubbo, although Daisy does speak, and a couple times you see her directly looking at the camera, a couple times sort of in disbelief as what Michael Rubbo is asking her to do. So there's a remnants of that older voice of God sort of controlling narrative, but at the same time, you see the film allowing Daisy to respond, sometimes in a contradictory way. So the idea of the voice of God, expository narrative or mode, is now being questioned. So in this particular case here, what we're looking at is we're trying to find different ways to tell the truth. And Michael Rubbo looks at a certain way to do it. There is at least an awareness that there is subjectivity and intentionality in films. And in that sense, it is closer to Cinema Verite, because we have the direct participation of the filmmaker, sometimes right in the shot. At one point, there's a part of the film where we see Michael Rubbo wander off to a library to look up information. I thought the film was called Daisy and not Michael. So there it is. So Rubbo believes that, let's be honest. Let's point out and underline the fact that this is a subjective viewpoint. So we are now definitely closer to this style of filmmaking that is cinema verite, that direct participation. So if we were to think of people that are sort of better known, or at least well known in terms of narrative documentaries, Michael Moore is someone that really would be along the same lines. Both Michaels, Rubbo, and Moore do the same kind of things, because they incorporate themselves into the story, into the actual shots. They're the ones often asking questions. They control the narrative, but they still allow people to speak, right? They're going to let them answer the question. They're not going to try to manipulate them or undercut them, but they still control the narrative to a certain degree, because they are the ones that are asking the questions. They're the ones that are urging on the subject to do certain things. And really what's happening here is this new idea is being formulated this early, which is the idea of the director as a persona, right? A persona, a character. And he's not playing a character. He's still, we'll say, if he's playing anything, he's playing a filmmaker. But there is this idea of a persona. Michael Moore probably is the most famous or popular exponent of this. That we know with Michael Moore, there's going to be a certain degree of cynicism and sarcasm. There's going to be some funny bits. There's going to be some embarrassing things on behalf of other people, of course. But Michael Moore has become a kind of persona that when we see his name attached to a film, we already get a sense of what's probably going to happen. It's going to be certainly, left of center, that's for sure. But it will involve Michael Moore, on some kind of investigation, some kind of inquiry into something, into American healthcare, gun lobbying, gun lobbyists, 9/11, Bowling for Columbine is an important film. Roger and Me is one we're going to look at. He investigates certain things that he, either with Roger and Me, had a direct invested interest in it because it affected him directly, and others, it's more like, as an American citizen, I'm concerned. So that's my persona, right? The concerned American citizen. Here, Michael Rubbo is playing something like it, of course, Canadian, but he's got a degree of curiosity. Like, why does Daisy want to have a facelift? That's kind of the main question. So the difference between the two, though, and there are, Moore has a very overtly constructed persona, like what I've just described to you. He's on an investigation, an inquiry. He is part of what he would call the great unwashed, the salt of the earth, the working class, because that's where he came from. Now, don't kid yourself. He is a millionaire now. He's done very, very well. But the persona is of this kind of, plain folk, working class, just regular kind of guy, just trying to find out stuff. Why is this? Why is this the way it is? And so as he inquires into these questions, he does it on our behalf, right? He does it for the sake of us being educated. And so that plain folk device, even though I'm a millionaire, says Michael Moore, I'm still one of you guys, right? So that's the persona he presents. Michael Rubbo is more sort of, he identifies who he is. We understand the relationship between Daisy and Michael because, Michael Rubbo, that is, because they both work in the same place. They know each other as co-workers. So they both work at the NFB, so there's the connection that they have. There's a degree of candidness in the conversations. They know each other, right? They're comfortable speaking to one another, and that's important. So Michael Rubbo does intervene from time to time in the film, and he does pose sometimes odd questions, and we're not quite sure what he's after. Is he trying to embarrass Daisy? Is he trying to sort of, get her to reveal some hidden childhood trauma that's caused her to really be concerned about, getting a facelift? So it's strange. He wants to both watch her. It's like he wants to wind her up and let her go, right? Wind her up just like a little toy and then watch her go. And that can be dangerous because we don't know what the answers to some of the questions are that he raises. And of course, he also has final say in the editing. So there is a kind of weird mix between objective, gazing at the same time as that subjective intervention, because it does make the film more problematic. It's not a pure cinema verite. There are moments where it is merely objective, much in the same way as Fog of War was last week when we talk about the fact that it appears expository, but it is very reflective and it contains many poetic moments. The numbers falling out of the airplanes, the dominoes falling across the maps. I mean, these are poetic images, and it is a combination. So here, this is not a kind of hard and fast cinema verite film, but certainly along those lines. Okay, here are sort of examples you'll see in the film, and hopefully you're watching this before watching the film, where Michael Rubbo intervenes, right? Mr. Peters, Rubbo leans over to Daisy and says, ask him what he's here for. Like, just do it. And like, oh, let's see what's going to happen. So he shifts his stance from being subjective, like, go ask him, talk to him, and then steps back and says, okay, let's film what's going to happen. And then I won't interact at all. And that's what I mean when I say it can shift back and forth. So none of those films, I mean, other than direct cinema verite of the two, I think is a slightly more problematic because, yes, there is direct intervention, but there are moments when the filmmaker steps back and simply lets the action unfold. So Rubbo enters a scene when he talks with Daisy and his daughter about their opposite approaches to love. So now he wants to dig a little bit further, right? He wants to engage with both subjects and get something going, get some friction going, because both Daisy and her daughter have different viewpoints about love. And that could be interesting, right? Could be cinematically interesting. It might reveal something about Daisy. Then there's this weird little bit and sort of around the middle of the film where Rubbo goes to the library to research information. In this case, it's our obsession with physical beauty and how much it's really changed. So we compare those scenes with Michael Rubbo interviewing Daisy in her kitchen, in her bedroom. We know he's there because we can hear his voice, right, just slightly off camera, or he might be just directly behind the camera, because remember, he's working with a cameraman, so he's there basically directing what's going on. But we know he's clearly in the room. Okay, that's something that is quite unusual in terms of NFB films. So what we would have typically in a Voice of God film is Daisy going to visit a doctor, and then visiting the plastic surgeon, and then possibly undergoing the plastic surgery. But all of this would be happening with little or no direct participation by Daisy. Daisy doesn't set the agenda as much as responds to it, because remember, Michael Rubbo is the one posing the questions. So she's responding to the situation rather than actively engaging, and has some degree of agency, right? She does control the narrative, but only insofar as she's merely responding to questions. So there's that. That would be what it would normally look like, but clearly it doesn't. There is some intervention quite often with Michael Rubbo in terms of seeing him or hearing him at least. Then there are bits where we see him doing something and Daisy's not even in the shot. Then there's the airport scene at the very tail end. I was there anyway, watching from a distance. So he knows that Daisy's about to leave, and it's almost like he's spying on her, which is, that's also problematic. So we don't know whether Daisy wanted him there. Excuse me. She wanted him to, was engaged all the way along, but then decides to leave to go to Europe. But there he is. Whether or not he's invited is kind of iffy. There's some friction there. But he said, I was there anyway, watching from a distance. So he's not actively involved with her, but he's still observing, right? He's still objectively kind of direct cinema style, just watching her. Then there's that strange pool scene where Daisy is kind of posing and displaying her body for the two men. She comes out of the pool, and they're basically commenting on the way she looks, which is something that you just would not do to someone in 2021. At least you shouldn't. But the pool scene is, again, Daisy very aware of herself as a being, herself in terms of someone that may or may not be beautiful to the eyes of others, looking for some kind of validation, and goes through it. And it's not that it's harsh, but it's the fact that someone wants to really be valued merely from the superficial level. It's not a problematic scene. It's an uncomfortable scene because the film really is about someone that wants to change their appearances. And along comes, Daisy in the pool, and these two men start commenting on her. So it's there, I think, to make us feel uncomfortable, but it doesn't reveal a lot about Daisy, except for maybe the fact that she has done this before. She doesn't mind posing for men and standing and having them comment on her body, because why else would she want the facelift? That's kind of Rubbo's conclusion. Okay, the voiceover narration, especially important during the actual facelift that we see, which is quite remarkable. The voiceover narration now again controls the narrative. We hear, I'm going to announce the bloody bits. Now here comes the nasty parts. Close your eyes. He does that. So again, controlling the narrative, controlling, in fact, even our response to it. And so Rubbo has the final say in this film. So as much as it is cinema verite, he still has the last word. Now, there are moments where Rubbo and Daisy have an agreement, or there is kind of that imaginary line that's drawn. And especially when he's in her bedroom and interviewing her in bed, there is a barrier, right? There's kind of a tacit agreement that this is as far as you go, right? I will do a variety of things, but there is a space that is mine, and you will not cross that. So we see kind of that imaginary line pop up periodically as we're watching the film, because Daisy has to have some degree of control over her life. And she says, here, that's where the line is drawn. And we see Rubbo at least trying to respect it. So think of the films we've watched so far. The first one being, not Louis Buñuel's film, but the first official film, the feature presentation, right, that you were quizzed on, Robert Flaherty's Nanook of the North. And there is that kind of patriarchal, condescending, almost colonial viewpoint of Nanook. Nanook does this and it does that, and this is an ancient tradition, and, he's having a really tough time. It's still observational, but we know that there was a lot of direct intervention before the cameras rolled to create a certain event, right? So there it's not purely observational. It appears to be, but we found out after that Flaherty set up many of these things. In other words, they were there for the sake of the camera. Again, much like Triumph of the Will, the entire Nuremberg rally was staged purely for the sake of filming it. It would not have occurred if the film was not commissioned to be made. Okay, so Michael Rubbo has a little bit of that patriarchal perspective. He not that he denigrates or disrespects what she's doing, but there's a kind of patriarchal overtone to his voices and not his voices, but his voiceover and his questions. And so even when Rubbo goes to visit the library to look at our obsession or historical obsession with beauty, is that something that really needed to be there? It could have simply be covered by one single voiceover. Did you know the following? But no, Rubbo takes the time to show us him in the library, going through books. We see shots of what he sees in the film. And is this part of, showing us the learning process that Michael Rubbo went through in order to understand what Daisy is doing, what it's all about? Okay, the contradictions of beauty are certainly one issue that is dealt with. The fact that, time eventually will ravage what is considered beauty, it just changes. And people remain beautiful in different ways. And we have, I think, a much wider vision of what is beautiful. If you look now in pop culture, which is usually a good barometer of what people consider to be beautiful, there's a much wider array of people. And we are looking at men and women and, trans individuals and a whole range of different people of shapes and sizes. So our idea of beauty has most certainly changed. And not only does time affect what we think of beauty, but time itself, right? Over time, we become less youthful. It just is. But more important, historically, our visions of beauty used to be much more strict than they are now. Now there's much wider, viewpoint, and people may think twice about going under the knife. But it seems like, okay, many may not go under the knife, but there seems to be this preoccupation with Botox and preoccupation with, puffing up one's lips. So as much as we think it's wider, the issues are still there. And people now pick a certain look and go after that one. So Daisy wants to change her future so she can reconnect with her past, her beautiful past. She was lovelier, or at least in her eyes, lovelier in the past. We see pictures of her when she was younger, and she was quite striking. But the idea of femininity, really at this point, because it was made in the 70s, there's quite a fixation on beauty. And so whether it's the beauty myth or the way in which feminism tried to reconstruct this notion of beauty, that was not all that women were. With anyone, it is not just what's on the outside, but what's more importantly on the inside. So femininity at this point had to a great degree to do with beauty. And this is kind of what this film is exploring. And Daisy is an individual living in the 70s who wanted to win a man because she'd been married before, but she thought she could do it simply through being beautiful, or at least getting a facelift. And so there are, a series of contradictions in the film, her life. This becomes a preoccupation that she has, and it's simply who she is. Other people can age gracefully or maybe not as preoccupied with it. Like I say, right now, we have a much wider palette to choose from of what we consider beautiful. And now, not uninterestingly, because what we call the baby boomers, now the largest chunk of the population, now in their 60s, what used to be old age in the 30s and 40s, now is 70s and 80s. So over time, right, this notion of beauty keeps changing. But the contradictions in Daisy's life is she thinks that, she can just be more, if she's prettier, she'll get a man, and does not ask sort of more serious questions like, what happened to the other husbands that you had? How did the relationships pan out? How did they fail? Like, maybe that's important too. So, over and above all of this, and these are all important questions, is the issue too of, as a visual medium, the film has to do with a visual content of ourselves, which clearly is the way we look and, how we consider ourselves beautiful, or how other people consider ourselves beautiful. And so some of the sections in the film really kind of show us different facets of that preoccupation with the visual aspects of our lives. For example, Daisy parading around for the man in the pool, and because the camera is there and she knows it's there, she's also parading for us, right? She's not unaware of the presence of the camera. She knows she's being filmed. So as she is parading around in her bathing suit for the man by the pool, she's also parading for us, right? So she has a larger audience. And so she is she's now sort of aware that this is how she will be judged. Because we don't really, at the end of the film, learn a whole lot about her. It's still very much on the surface. Daisy's conversation with her daughter about men and marriage and their differing opinions of love, quite different. And so it really sort of points out what will become more important in the future. Because remember, this is roughly the mid-70s. And so things have most significantly changed. Our views about relationships, our views about beauty, about love, and the fact that an individual can lead a very successful and happy life without necessarily getting married or having kids. We have a much wider range of options. But Daisy seems to be stuck in this viewpoint that, she needs a man to validate herself. She needs to be beautiful to validate herself. And Rubbo doesn't really push that any further, kind of presents it to us. Now, Daisy is not unaware of her, her situation. At one point, she asked for a single coffee with a double standard, right? So she has a sense of humor about it. We see there's a part where Rubbo talks to plastic surgeons, and the fact that breast implants are now becoming more and more prevalent, even at this early point. And one of the comments, the doctor says, and he's talking about a woman that has just had plastic surgery, says, now she's perfect. Wow, right? That's quite a statement. Now she's perfect, implying that what was the problem before? And so we have questions about beauty that are raised, maybe not answered to a satisfactory degree to a 2021 audience, but certainly at that time, the questions being raised in the first place were still valid, right? We can look a little bit deeper than simply on the surface, right? And talking about, just on the surface of our beauty, our face, and what we look like. So there's quite a few times when the film does appear to try to get a little bit further, but it doesn't go far enough, because I think if it did, it would become a very different sounding film, a very different looking film. So and at the end of the day, we still have Michael Rubbo and Daisy, and in their interaction, we have Daisy questioning, for example, after the facelift, like, how could I have done that? Well, she wanted to, right? Because her actions are reinforced by everything around her. All right, this double standard that she's aware of. The fact that beauty can only be something that the youth have. These things she is more than aware of, and yet she still falls for it, because she says, how could I have done this to myself and gone under the knife, and yet everyone telling her to, because there's a strange scene quite early in the film where other people who work with her start commenting about Daisy and the way she looks, and it's on film. I've been in that cafeteria at the NFB when I was at school in the 80s in Montreal. That's a small cafeteria. Even if Daisy sat at the other end of the room, she would have heard them. So it's a really strange thing to include a conversation with her coworkers about the way Daisy looks. And some of it is harsh, but there it is. So Daisy is aware that she looks a certain way, would love to be able to deal with it in any other way than a facelift, and yet she still goes under the knife. So compared to what would be happening today, it is something that she chose to do, and we're really, at the end of the film, not 100% sure whether this is something that satisfied her in some way. Daisy visits a psychiatrist at one point and says, actually, the psychiatrist is one of the few that tries to get under her skin, right? Literally, and says, if you are doing this for a man, it's the wrong reason, and you're psychologically unstable. So that is something that is really worth considering. But again, it doesn't get pursued any further. We have Daisy leaving to go to Europe to hopefully visit someone. There may be someone waiting over there, and this kind of almost the end of Casablanca, when one flies off into the distance, somehow to a better life. There's a kind of the same similar tone that's going on here. Obviously, it's not a fiction film; it's reality, but the same sort of thing is going on. She's going to fly off to Europe, for romance, and this is the idea that we see the postcard, having a wonderful time. Yes, we hope it is, and then this male gaze that is really part and parcel of the film, it's she's aware of it. She says it's true. A man, I think, is attracted to a nicer package. She is very self-aware, but that self-awareness, unfortunately, does not take it to the next step, where she basically says, "Yeah, but I am who I am." There's something with Daisy that we don't ever find out, like why she can be both self-aware of this beauty myth and yet fall for it. But still, the film is constructed to underline that male gaze. The male gaze of the men by the pool, of Michael Rubbo looking at Daisy, the psychiatrist, the doctors, the plastic surgeon. The whole film is one long male gaze at Daisy. Daisy looks back sometimes, but it's a kind of it's defeatist. It's a defeatist look that we know that she is, she's going to be stuck. And of course, at the time that Daisy's kind of looking around, she's in the beauty parlor. There's this sad contrast between a much older woman than her and then a much younger woman. So she's kind of in the middle. She is reminded of her her looks when she was younger. And the young woman that we see, quite lovely and getting her hair done. And then the older woman, sort of not considered the same way. That's, her best years are behind her. A very derogatory and patriarchal kind of thing to say. So the film tries to get under the surface of this whole issue of the beauty myth. Doesn't do that good of a job. But I'm sorry, it was not in the 70s, but the early 80s. But even in the early 80s, the idea sort of began at that time. But in the early 80s, even by 1982, there was still that sort of growing preoccupation with plastic surgery and breast implants and all the rest of it. So it looks both very dated, and yet it still deals with things that are happening now. And if you were to ask yourself, does the film have any kind of relevance today? If anything, it would be a historical artifact of someone that is both aware of that beauty myth and yet falls under its sway. And, today the price of plastic surgery may be lower, but as much as we have women that say, no, I'm going to age gracefully, we have just as many young women who fall under that same beauty myth that may look different. And somehow it's sold to them as, take control of your life. You can have the freedom, providing you get a Botox injection. We're really both further along and not, right? It's very contradictory. So consider that as you watch the film, because it is an interesting document. It's very much of its time and place, but we can think, looking back to the document, essentially 40 years ago, to 1982, just how dated some of the attitudes are, and yet how some of those attitudes are still around. So I'm going to take a quick break right here, and I'm going to move over to the next set of slides. And through the magic of digital, we're going to see you in just a moment. Okay, we're back with our second set of slides on Don't Look Back. Sorry, but writing so much, I keep wanting to put an apostrophe between the N and the T, but it isn't. It is Don't Look Back. It is what it is. Okay, so this is a film that is a very famous documentary on Bob Dylan made in the 60s. And it is more in keeping with the direct cinema mode. And this is more along the lines of observational cinema. There is the alleged belief that the filmmakers are not going to participate in any way or directly intervene in any way. The events that we see, they're simply going to be a fly in the wall. So we've talked a little bit about direct cinema and verité. Dana Knight says at a basic level, cinema verité and direct cinema can be defined as two cinematic practices employing lightweight filming equipment, handheld cameras, live synchronous sound. New groundbreaking technologies being developed in the 1860s in Canada, US, and Europe that offered filmmakers the possibility to do away with the necessity of large crews, studio sets, tripod-mounted equipment, and special lights in the making of a film. Again, that is true, but once that raw footage is filmed and done and developed, it still sits on an editing table. So whether or not the content of the shots are observational and non-interventionist or interventionist, there's still the editing stage, and it is there that a whole range of other issues can come up. Okay, so the differences. Cinema verité refers to documentaries characterized by self-reflexivity. Now, not maybe to the degree that we talk about, say, the fog of war. Cinema Verite, when it first started out, allowed for the intervention of the filmmaker to come out from behind the camera or off screen and be part of the action, interact with the subject. So it becomes the beginning of self-reflexivity, not to the sort of poetic degree that the fog of war was, but it starts there because we realize that the presence of the filmmaker in the shot and the interaction they have with their subjects can change the outcome. It's pretty clear. So because of that, the filmmaker believe that the films that they make present the truth in a greater degree or to a greater degree. And again, that it's true in the sense that if the film were, closed circuit footage, that might be the closest we can get. But the filmmakers choose where to stand, what they choose to frame, what they choose to leave out, right? It's as much about what's left out as what's left in. So the filmmaker does try to guarantee some degree of truth, but always question, even the frame and what is left out as well as what's left in, the sound, what other shots, what other positions they could have taken, close up, far away. So yes, it is observational, but always keep those questions in mind. So direct cinema tries to observe as unobtrusively or as non-interventionally as possible. It doesn't intrude on the reality or the truth that is being filmed. It avoids asking questions in the form of interviews, talking heads. So kind of a fly in the wall. You can compare that to sort of a fly in the soup, which of course would ruin the soup or at least change it in some way. It's not a very good metaphor, but you get the idea. But so direct cinema, more fly in the wall. Cinema Verite, there is direct intervention. So Pennebaker, a very famous direct cinema filmmaker, is quoted as saying, "As far as I'm concerned, it was never meant to be a documentary. I don't like them much. To my mind, the most interesting filmmaker that I ever knew about was Robert Flaherty, who made Nanook of the North, which we've seen. It was about this Eskimo, and Flaherty didn't try to tell us everything there was about the life of an Eskimo. He just wanted to show you what it was like to be an Eskimo, which are now Inuit people. That's rather derogatory. And that's the feeling I tried to put across, just to observe. And yes, to a certain degree, there is that." And he goes on, "I was never interested in educating people." Now, what does that mean? That's that reference to John Grierson and educating the working class, right? The salt of the earth about political matters and social matters and mores and traditions and so on. So he says, "I was never interested in educating people about Dylan, right? About Bob Dylan. First of all, I don't know enough about him. Who does? Well, of all the people in the history of pop culture, no one is more enigmatic than Bob Dylan. Nobody knows really anything about him. So he is a really interesting character that even at this early point, to try to know something about him, quote unquote, would have been pretty difficult because he's a very guarded, cagey kind of character. Any interviews that you ever read with Dylan, that's the way he's like. Very caustic. That's who he is. That's his persona. So besides, that's Dylan's business. If he wanted to educate people, I'm sure he knows how to do it. What I wanted to do was to just be present when Dylan enacted his whole life and show you what he deals with and what interests him. So what he deals with and what interests him, Dylan, not for 1 second did forget that the camera was there, because there are times when, again, I want to stress this: people behave differently in front of a camera, and much like, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Leonard Cohen, these are people just starting out on their career. So every move is calculated. Every pronouncement, every behavior is calculated for the larger picture. This is the persona I wish to present. So how's Dylan represented in this film? Well, he's a young man who's starting out. He's a folk singer. He's not gone electric yet. He's sort of on the cusp. A lot of people are interested in him. He's about to make the move out of, the coffee houses of Greenwich Village and move out into the main stage, which he clearly did. And so that's that. It's Dylan on the cusp, right? An always interesting time to be in for an artist, especially an artist that believes in themselves to the degree that Dylan did, that Leonard Cohen believed in. And that's really what forms their persona. They're already acting as if they are stars, because they know that this is what they need to do. So the film becomes a vehicle for them to express their persona to a much greater public. Not just, beatniks that hang around Greenwich Village in the mid-60s, but everybody. So the mode of documentary that Pennebaker is using is this basically observational mode. That's really what's going on. So in the difference between cinema verite and the direct cinema form, Pennebaker can't acknowledge that there is an art in his craft. There's this notion that observational cinema, things go in and out of focus and things sort of look really, haphazard. And surprise, those very things are the tools that reality TV filmmakers are using to kind of trick us into believing that what we're seeing is a documentary, when in fact, every shot is staged. Everything is rehearsed and practiced and reshot. And if you suddenly, move things, just the frame suddenly gets all blurry or the images get blurry, we think, oh, we're watching a document. No, they are trained to do that. It's a little trick that they do to remind us, oh, you're watching a document. So the notion that there is an art to the craft, no, absolutely there is. There is, maybe not directly, but when you think about the film, its construction, its visual narrative, choice of shots, juxtapositions, think of Eisenstein, that tonal, overtonal, intellectual montage, all of that is going on. So Pennebaker kind of hides behind that and says, no, he wants to just let Dylan perform his art form. And it's true. We see him performing, but we also see him interacting with people, with hanger-ons, with business people, with reporters. And Dylan is being Dylan. Dylan is performing, but he performs for the camera. So I have a problem with, direct cinema as being pure and purely observational, because I don't think someone that is aware of a camera crew ever forgets that completely. You might in the moment, but you get out of that moment very quickly. So Pennebaker says, the trouble with making documentary is that it really requires a lot of artfulness, and most people making documentaries for one reason or another feel embarrassed at being artful. Well, there is a sort of explicit sense of art. We saw that in Baraka, for example. We saw that in The Fog of War. There was that poetic quality. Here with direct cinema, there's almost a clash or a sort of a disconnect between art and direct cinema, because you're implying that the filmmaker is picking and choosing certain images over others because one of them happens to be more artful than the other. And that's kind of what they want to get away from. So that's why this real shtick about, it's not art. Well, yes, it's cinema. It's a kind of art. It's a visual art. And you want people not to think about the shots that you've chosen to represent Bob Dylan. So there is always in direct cinema this clash between it being an art form and it being, a document, a visual document that is the truth, quote unquote. So just keep those things in mind as you watch the two short clips. You won't be watching the whole film, but there's a couple of clips, one in particular, which is basically Bob Dylan tearing a Times reporter a new one, going up and down him. And, I'm sorry, but Dylan is being Dylan. He's not being a person. He's being Dylan. And we now know when we read biographies about, movie stars and people that they are very well aware of who they are and they can present themselves being different ways. And so we need to be mindful of that. As much as it looks observational and truthful, those particular kinds of people, performers in particular, that are used to being up in front of people and performing, I don't think you ever get a true, honest portrayal of who they are. They're always conscious of the persona they're trying to depict to us. So the textbook does talk about cinema verite, and yes, direct cinema and cinema verite uses lightweight cameras. They kind of film on the fly, but the main difference is the degree of intervention that the filmmaker has, that cinema verite, that it has in those particular shots. So we see in Don't Look Back this weird hybrid of the two, that there is an awareness of the camera, at least for Dylan, and for sure with Daisy. She is clearly aware of the camera. But we have these observational moments at the same time when once Rubbo kind of, winds up Daisy, He lets her go, stands back and watches what's going to happen. He has sort of implicit control over it. So it is a very strange view of that cannot be sort of cleanly divided. It is this or it is that. So we need to always be aware that there will be sort of moments of both of those. But remember also that no one ever is truly forgetting that the camera is there, especially with someone who is, by their very nature, a performer, right, quote unquote. Okay, so Dylan, of all people, I know more about what you do. If you don't have to ask me, anything just by looking, it's this is that famous scene that luckily is on YouTube, so I want you to have a look at it. It's really, it's remarkable because Dylan is he's very prickly when it comes to the press. And from a friend of mine that I know was a huge Dylan fan, the only time Bob Dylan was ever apparently completely open with a reporter was a kid in high school that Dylan went to. He went to a high school in, I believe he lived in Minnesota. This kid contacted him, said who he was and what school he was associated with. And Dylan said, sure, no problem. So you can imagine this kid blew his mind going, my God, I'm going to interview Bob Dylan. And he did. And Dylan was very forthright, very honest, because he knew this kid was from the same school and he had done much of the same thing. He was a writer, so he felt a kind of kinship. But that's a rarity. And according to my friend, that was one of the very few times it ever happened. So otherwise, he's very prickly, very, very caustic towards the press. So to see him try to tear someone a new one really is not a revelation. We know that's what he's like. That's his personality. Okay, so you can ask yourselves, do we see opposing perspectives that are presented in the film between this sort of observational mode and the cinema direct mode? Direct cinema and cinema verite. My French is coming up here from school from the 80s. But those two forms, do coexist at certain times. But the idea of don't look back, that's an interesting title, isn't it? Because Dylan is on the cusp of becoming, an important star, a spokesman of the generation, whatever that generation may be. This is before, he starts singing to larger and larger crowds. But the notion of not looking back, right, looking only forward, is there a contradiction? Well, there's an awareness of where one comes from, but there's a real preoccupation with where Dylan is going and setting the stage for that next step, right? They're taking it to the next level, as people say, right? And so that's what Dylan is kind of doing. He's, that very famous shot. It's not in there, but it's him moving from the dressing room to the stage. What better way to encapsulate and visualize the notion of don't look back? We see him move from the dressing room all the way through to being up on stage, where he belongs, where Dylan wants to be. And so when Dylan is presenting himself like this, he's saying, here's where I'm going to be. This film will help me to do this. And that's why he agrees to be in the film, because otherwise he's kind of prickly and sort of cagey and, reserved towards anyone that wants to interact with him, that wants to kind of get in under his skin. Like, there would never be a, Bob Dylan Diary of a Facelift. Never going to happen. But, Diary of something about Dylan, that would be just as difficult. So Dylan does engage with his audience, with his hanger-ons, with his, groupies and so on, in a very specific kind of way. And he is reticent. He is, reluctant to open up. So we have, a variety of images of Dylan, sort of, it's like a prism. We see different parts of him being revealed just momentarily. Simple questions, asking his attitude towards life, whether he's angry, do you love people? He has a nice sort of what seems to be an honest response and rapport with Joan Baez, again, also very young, and she's about to move, to the next level as well. So he is kind of, hanging around people that are going to help him. But that strange little scene says, put your hand up to your face. And says, I can't pose. No, you don't have to pose. Just do it. And so you don't have to pose. Interesting turn of phrase for a film that purports to just tell you the truth. He's now revealing that I'm posing. Okay, therein lies the contradiction. An awareness of being filmed, even though Pennebaker is talking about, direct cinema. We're just going to watch. So he's both authentic and reserved, right? He is both becoming a star and trying to present himself as, as a kind of everyman. So there is something that is really interesting in the film. The particular sequence with Joan Baez, you can probably find that on YouTube. I didn't post it, but you can find bits and pieces of that entire movie. Alan Veneman, for example, talks about how Dylan and Baez have this wonderful duality. They're authentic with one another's, but they're also stars. They are trying to be as pure as they can, and of course, the more money they make, the more difficult it is to remain pure, remain, anchored to your roots, and be able to look back, which is what is going on. So those are the two sets of slides. I've gone for about an hour. Do have a look at the film and have a look at some of the clips from Dylan's Don't Look Back. But the feature film is Daisy, the story of a facelift, filmed in 1982, but discussed for a number of years, going back almost to the mid-70s. And the main sort of idea we want to think about is the differences between direct cinema, which is non-interventionist. It is the fly-on-the-wall idea, versus cinema verite, or cinema truth, that is interventionist. And the filmmaker interacts directly and shapes not only the narrative, but shapes the action which is occurring in front of the camera. So hopefully we'll see each other on Wednesday. I will sort of break down Daisy a bit more detail. If you do the quiz beforehand, please, for the viewing quiz, save your answers. For this week, I've noticed I haven't seen that happening at all. So those of you who are now doing this, I appreciate it, because otherwise I have nothing to mark. So have a good weekend. It's Sunday morning, or early Sunday morning. And at this point now, we're going to just pack it up, and we'll see you soon on Wednesday.